question to the council, is it the word, well, question to both of you really, is it the word incompatible? Is the supporting text not actually saying within open land there are essentially just existing uses, e.g. residential and utility services? The aim of the policy is to not disturb these uses unnecessarily, and they're allowed to remain, yada, yada, yada. So is it not, I'm struggling to see, is it just the word incompatible maybe, Ms. Denby?
I think that, and then also just reading in terms of point 2 of the policy, it talks about, you know, with the development proposals will be supported whether for sports recreation. Residential's missing from that list, or whether there could be to support canal-based activity. You know.
Yeah, I think it's right that residential is obviously omitted from that use. Otherwise, I think there'd be, I think we'd probably have more people at this session. I think I take the point. I'm reluctant to go too far with this because then I think it does put the council in a difficult position where it's referring to effectively new residential development. And obviously this designation of open land goes much wider than just the canal, doesn't it? It includes obviously land around it. So I think there's a danger here in trying to sort of maybe meet you halfway with it, that it sort of ends up doing more harm than good, really. I think what the council could maybe do in taking it away is look at 6.45 and maybe a recognition that the area of designated open land obviously does include the canal, and maybe refer to the canal and, you know, its associated infrastructure as, you know, in the same way that you refer to residential or utility services. I think what, and again, Ms. Layden can jump in, I think maybe what the aim of the policy to do perhaps isn't necessarily to be overly restrictive in this regard. It is more against more significant forms of development.
Thank you. Yeah, so very briefly, we do make reference to the Grand Union Canal in 6.44, recognition of that. I think the point here is you know, development proposals within designated open land, and is that 2A point, that compatibility is compatible with the use and character of the open lands. We have to remember it's got to be considered in the context of the use of that open land. So if the use of that open land is the canal, which it is in this instance, you know, is it compatible with that use? And I think that's where I don't see the particular issue, but I think it is maybe more of an issue with that reference to residential in 6.45 and how residential moorings could be considered residential, I would have said. But we'll take it away in any case. And we will look at that again.
On NE 12 under Part C, proposals for new development involving existing inappropriate uses. What's an existing inappropriate use?
So I think it probably goes back to that point again on the incompatible with that designation point. You know, what is that? And anything that may be seeking to remove some of those, you know, taken in the context, there are only examples provided in that. I see the point of effectiveness on this.
Do you mean, in Part C, do you mean incompatible uses?
I would probably say maybe more appropriate to probably to be clear on that.
Again, I don't want to put words in the council's mouth, but I think what I'm sort of sensing is that the council perhaps recognise, obviously clearly, you know, the canal is part of this designation. I think what the council is trying to balance is recognised as existing uses here, but equally sort of trying to guard against effectively treating this just like white land and there being a sort of, open presumption in favour of, maybe new residential development. I think what the council probably could do is maybe take away this, have a look at 6.45, have a look at some of the wording that's used in NE12 around words like inappropriate uses, and it might be that there could be a sort of nod towards the canal and what the council sort of would or wouldn't support there. That might be a way forward.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does that make sense, Mr. Denby? I think probably, I think I'm sort of speaking for Mr. Bristow here, but I think we accept that there could be greater flexibility here. But equally, I think we've got to be mindful that the council doesn't want to sort of open this up to just any residential development, because that's obviously, the purpose of NE12. That's, completely contrary to its purpose. And then that takes you back to NE8. We talked about criterion 2 and criterion 3. Just off the top of my head, you could even referring criterion 2 back to SS1 if you then change SS1, that sort of overarching spatial strategy. Like you say, the majority of it will be in the green belt. It would take you to green belt policy in SS1. Just off the top
we'll consider it. Yes.
Off the top of my head, that might be sort of, considering accordance with SS1. You go to SS1, you're outside of the built-up area. Okay, it's probably going to be green belt. National planning policy applies, essentially. Anything else on any 8 or any 12? No. Okay, we'll move on. NE9, I didn't have any specific questions, again, unless the council was proposing any changes. A lot of the issues around flood risk, really, I think that in terms of representations relate to sites, and that's where it will come on, as we have been doing, looking at site-specific details and where flood risk occurs on specific sites in the plan. Really, NE9 is essentially sort of a development management policy, and again, you suggested some changes, I think, which are essentially for effectiveness and predominantly in the supporting text, I think. Or is it one of the CC policies?
Yeah, because I think the question related to those CC policies, to change them more in the CC section.
And there is a fair bit of overlap between NE9 and the CC policies anyway, so we can come on to that in the CC policies, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of overlap with some of the other CC policies here, isn't there, as well? So again, we've got separate sessions on those. We can come back to those. Which takes us on to NE10 and NE11 then. So again, sorry, Ms. Harbridge.
Sorry, and clearly I think I'm probably in the wrong place for saying this, but the CC6 one, the Protection Environment Policy, Pollution, it goes back really similar point to what I was making about the wastewater going in, that the actions of the council in certain site selections, etc., are actually counterproductive to these policies, and it's the same with CC6 because they've gone through the process and they've picked some of the worst sites for certainly in Berkham said the worst sites for sustainability and for pollution because it's going to promote car. And I accept I'm probably in the wrong place, but I did see it there. So that's,
I think that's
the point.
Yeah, no, I think you fairly caveated your words there, but just again, I suppose my question would be, and CC6 I have just seen, and this is probably my error, isn't there listed in the afternoon session. But your view on CC6, again, in a similar way to we talked about previously, would it be that that sets the right approach and that the allocations are inconsistent with that.
Yes, I would. And it's not being used to this process. We're probably getting this in the wrong place, and it might be we would come back to this on the site selection, but that's up to you.
Great.
Yeah. Just on any 10, first criterion, development proposals will be expected to protect and retain existing trees and hedgerows. Is there some potential conflict there where obviously development's going to come forward, there's potentially, obviously, a lot of the allocated sites, redevelopment of sort of greenfield sites, new access points, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think there's any conflict there? Because there are going to be existing trees and hedgerows which are removed and maybe replaced as part of wider landscaping strategies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, so that is accommodated within policy NE 11.2, where development is expected to incorporate and establish 2 or more net new suitable trees. So where trees are lost within NE 10, we would expect the replacements to be provided in accordance with NE 11.
Does it say that?
It doesn't cross-reference there. No, it doesn't.
Again, I would just add something in supporting text there just to recognise that, there are going to be occasions where existing trees and hedgerows are lost. And I think somebody could quite rightly pick that up and say, well, that's contrary to development plan, that's contrary to policy NE 10. Whereas actually that's not what you're saying. It might be that you need to caveat that where possible or where appropriate, etc. I think there needs to be a caveat on point 1 under NE 10, and there also needs to be additional supporting text, which then takes the sort of reader of the plan to NE 11. I think, as you say, that's where you go to. That's your sort of mitigation. That's your sort of offsetting. So I think it just needs to be a bit of signposting there.
That's fine.
Yeah. Which takes us to NE 11 then. Some new landscape and tree plans were rejected as part of development proposals. Again, is this an all development proposals? Is this a sort of, obviously, presumably this is a proportionate approach. You might have some change of use in a town centre, etc. What's this referring to?
We would expect that the majority of development proposals to provide new landscaping and tree planting, and that would be applied in accordance with the open space policy that we discussed yesterday. Criterion 1 says as part of development proposals. I think that's sufficiently clear and doesn't need any further clarification where they may not be suitable.
Town centre site, for example, or a change of use, how is that considered under NE 11? Is it some sort of financial contribution? Is it off-site provision? How am I demonstrating I comply with NE 11?
Policy HCI does provide the flexibility for the off-site contributions.
I think just to clarify also on point 2, at the very end of point 2 there, where it can be demonstrated that on-site planting cannot be achieved, a commuted sum will be secured to provide off-site provision for nature recovery in Dacorum.
But why 2 trees?
I think our answer to that is set out in the climate change in matter 10. With regard to the national tree planting policy and
National tree planting policy.
excuse me for a minute.
I think the concerns that we have with this criteria is, again, it's very specific, and it goes back to that point about, does it miss the point and purpose of what you're trying to achieve? So all development will be expected to incorporate and establish 2 or more net new suitable trees per dwelling on site. We know that that's not going to be achievable on all sites. Where a tree or hedgerow is lost through development, a suitable replacement must be provided, which will demonstrate the same characteristics as the lost tree. Why? There may be actually some instances where a developer might say, well, you know, we're getting rid of a lot of sort of self-seeded trees, which actually we don't want to provide anything with the same characteristics. We want to provide something which is better. The same characteristics and length of hedgerow. Again, you may have a developer say, well, actually, no, we can provide something, doesn't have to be the same characteristics, we might be providing something different, but something which is better. I just think it's a very tightly worded requirement, and it runs a risk, I think, of becoming a sort of mathematical exercise of, aha, we provided 8 trees, therefore we're okay. Does it miss the point? Is it about, as Mr. Thompson said this morning, you're seeking good design, you're seeking highest levels of design, excellence in terms of your urban design, your layout. I do just worry that you end up in this sort of almost sort of mathematical tick box exercise rather than actually seeking what's best for that place and that town or that settlement. And again, why 100 square meters? It's just, we can take it away. It might be that we come back to it in terms of, like you said, you referred to some of these sort of sustainable design and construction policies. Maybe the answer sort of overlaps with that, so we can maybe come back to it. And maybe that's what we do given the time as well. But I think we'd probably just put our sort of cards on the table that when we do come back to that, I think we are struggling with this. It's very, very detailed, and I just worry it sort of loses the main point of what you're trying to achieve.
And it crops up in other policies. So it crops up in the ones we're dealing with this afternoon. So Mr. Birkinshaw's right. We can come back to it. But I think yeah. Obviously, the NPPF and different versions of the NPPF put different emphasis. The importance of trees. We're not saying anything against that in terms of a rational approach, because that's endorsed by policy. It's got to be environmentally a good thing. Where the concern comes is the specifics of the requirement. Are they whips? We've got a reference to nursery standard. What's nursery standard? Where are they going to go? Are they going to be native species? Are they going to be compatible with the ecosystem? A lot of questions there in terms of a potentially very inflexible policy, and also an interaction with biodiversity net gain. Do your trees count towards that? Do they not? So yes, maybe let's, as Mr. Birkinshaw said, let's sort of lay our cards, horrible as they may sound, on the table in relation to that particular criteria, and we'll come back to it when we're coming to some of the other requirements later this afternoon, which also sort of reference that requirement to plant 2 trees. Does that sound fair, Mr. Harbridge?
You look at me with trepidation, sir. I'd just like to make a point going off from what the inspectors have just said. My suggestion for this would be to look at the environmental effects of the planting, and certain trees, certain hedgerows extract more bad gases, etc., out of the air. There's been many studies of this in Birmingham, just putting hedgerows in front of the houses, and that would be a lot. In that, we're going to lose a lot of green belt here if this goes forward. And the green belt has always been going back to the core strategy inspector, it's accepted that it was it's the green lungs of the area. And if they were more specific about actually or developing policies that promoted a better environment, rather than just saying we want to plant, like you said, a self-seeding tree that takes nothing out of the air, is no good to you. So it'd be my suggestion that they created policies that actually looked at.
I think you're on the right line, certainly, and I think that's where we're going with it. Let's return to this, because I don't want to just jump in something and say and rush it and go, yeah, you should change it to say this. But there's a bit more thought, I think, needed here around the effectiveness of moving away from that. So let's say sort of big. I don't want it to become sort of this tick box mathematical equation of, you know, how many trees you provide. It's about quality, and it's about good design and sort of you know, good placemaking, really. So let's return to that one. Was there any other comments then on any of the other sort of remaining NE policies? So they're the only questions that we had. No. Anything from the council? No. Okay, we'll adjourn for lunch. We've got a slightly shorter lunch break, so apologies for that. But again, thank you for sort of sticking with it and allowing us to get through. There's a lot there. There's a lot of policies. There's a lot of detail, but it's useful just to sort of take that time and spend a bit of time and care just to go through some of these requirements, especially around sort of the canal and sort of internal conflicts. But we will adjourn for lunch, and then we'll see you back at 2 o'clock. Yeah.
And if it's okay, we have one participant for after lunch who's particularly concerned, and I'm looking over there, with the CCs, the CC policies. If it's all right with everyone, perhaps if we deal with those first, CC1, CC5. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, let's resume. Thank you all for eating quickly. And thank you, Mr. Berrant. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay, from the HBF. Got the council here. I presume we don't need to go around and do introductions, or else that would be a very silent session. So, do you feel you need to cover anything in terms of emergency procedures, Mr. Layden? Maybe worthwhile.
Just for the sake of process on, yes. So we're not expecting a fire alarm today. The fire evacuation alarm in the form is a voice alarm system rather than a traditional system siren. The alarm will announce that the building must be evacuated due to an emergency. On hearing the fire alarm, everyone must immediately leave the building by the nearest available route, which is for the council chamber stairwell to the right as you leave the chamber, or to the left and past the lifts as an alternative option. Please follow a fire marshal. If in the event of a fire you would need assistance in using the stairs, please make reception aware. The main assembly point is at the Market Square, which is just outside of the council offices, across the pedestrian lights, and a short walk along the high street will get you there. Toilets are located to the left after the lifts and also by the cafe on the ground floor. The hearing session is being live streamed and recorded to be made available after the sessions. Please be aware and leave the council chambers if you do not wish to be filmed.
Excellent, thank you. And before the break, we said we're coming on to the CC culture policies. So that's CC1 to, let's also include CC6, because although it's not there listed on the programme, we'll probably sort of take those policies somewhat holistically. Now, I'm aware that in this instance in particular, the council have proactively suggested various main modifications. So I think as we go through the policies, we'll probably just take it policy by policy initially. It would be useful to touch on those, to see what they do, to see whether they're necessary for soundness and what the sort of rationale is there and if we support them. So we'll come on to that. I'm aware Mr. Berrant from the HBF is here and has made some points about these. I may sort of co-opt or summarize your points because in a few instances they tally with some points that we were, some points we wanted to explore, but obviously do of course raise, your hand whenever you want to come in, and I'll turn to you at certain points, I'm sure. So the first question we had, which related to policy CC1, which is climate change mitigation and adaptation, is the objective of the plan to achieve net zero by 2030, and the council position is no, as very eloquently explained in your hearing statement. And does then the second question, so we've got that very clearly, does policy CC1, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, set an appropriate and effective basis? So absolutely fine, and I think where there was some potential confusion in this from our perspective was that obviously the council's declared a climate emergency, has a certain approach to reducing implications for climate change, and that's absolutely fine. Corporately, it's for the council to set whatever strategies they see fit. That refers to 2030 and supporting text, okay, but then when we move on to policy CC1, is there a particular angle to that? And really, it's about where that balance is struck, I think. We've already talked about, if we come on to policy CC1, we've already talked about criterion 2F to some extent in terms of requiring development to specify construction materials with low embodied carbon. So broadly, I can see, we can both see the aim of this policy. There are certain elements that stick out. That was one that we'll probably come back to because that's more covered by another CC policy. But I think laying our cards on the table, in short, we're really not convinced that that isn't a sort of an effective basis for decision taking. Broadly, as I see it from the HBF's representation, they are of the view that CC1 is in line with broadly in line with NPPF paragraph 161, so there's consistency with policy there in their view. But the key thing I wanted to explore really was criterion 2B. So where carbon emissions cannot be mitigated, collecting contributions towards a carbon offset fund. So I think from my perspective and Mr. Birkinshaw's perspective, it'd be really useful to know what the plan seeks to achieve in terms of carbon reductions. And is that on the basis of saying going above existing standards? How does that operate relative to the thresholds that the plan sets in terms of climate change? So if I go to the council first, just to talk me through that, that'd be really helpful.
So this cross-references, this is CC1 is the strategic policy, and then this cross-references with a number of other policies in terms of how the implementation would work. So in policy CC2, sustainable design and construction, we have a mitigation principle to limit carbon dioxide emissions from the ongoing use of development and follow the energy hierarchy. And then in policy CC3, we have one where all development is expected to reduce carbon emissions by following the energy hierarchy, such as prioritising reducing energy demand through good design, orientation and layout, followed by operational efficiency before considering renewable and low carbon energy sources, and further requirements on major development to show how the performance gap will be closed and implement a recognised monitoring regime. Policy CC3 continues to provide support for development that improves on target emission rates, but it doesn't set a requirement for that. And similarly, it supports a number of accreditation, nationally recognised accreditation scheme, which development may choose to comply with.
Just, thank you. So let's say we have Part L, we have Briam, very good. We have those thresholds in policy CC3 along with the encouragement to go beyond those. Are we talking, and forgive me if I'm a broken record on this, are we talking the additional level above those standards that would go into a carbon offset fund if you can't go above that, or are we talking not meeting those Part L standards in the first instance because you have to anyway? So yeah, if you could just talk me through exactly where that threshold is set, that would be really useful.
The plan's approach to carbon emissions has changed over plan preparation. I think you may have seen before that previously in the Emerging Strategy for Growth, we did set targets, but those have been removed. I think this ties in with our answer to our hearing statement for CC5, which is one of the last questions about why this is necessary. The plan still does seek development to achieve sustainability measures, which do not exceed Part L, but can run alongside it and show how development is highly sustainable. And that is captured within parts of the policy elements with CC3. And again, we also spoke about tree planting in relation to CC2. It is those additional elements which don't relate to Part L, but which the policies seek to secure that the carbon offset fund would relate to.
If I were, and sorry, sort of to start on this note, so you've entirely right, encouraging development to be of highest development ecological standards, which you've got in policy CC3, which doesn't actually require going beyond Part L. It says strongly encouraged. Okay, fair enough. You want to encourage that. That's understandably a good environmental outcome. But there was mention there, Ms. Covington, that you previously went out on a sort of more targets-based, more specific basis in terms of, well, what are we aiming for? And that you rode back from that position, presumably, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because that was incompatible with the position in government policy. So where I'm slightly struggling is the carbon offsetting a requirement? And if so, what is that looking to achieve?
The carbon offset would be required where parts of the policies are not achieved. So, for example, in my hearing statement, I've referred to CC42A about on-site renewable energy generation, and we would expect such measures to reduce carbon emissions, and therefore, if a major development could demonstrate that it couldn't achieve on-site renewable energy generation, we could take a contribution to enable renewable energy measures to be delivered elsewhere in the borough.
Can we're skipping amongst policies, but I'm still not quite getting it in terms of carbon offsetting. Do you, Mr. Perrin, do you have a view on, well, I mean, we're sort of nominally on CC1 and the criteria around carbon offsetting, but also then skipping between other policies. What's your perspective on that, or the HPS?
I think in terms of the way, and it's difficult because it's trying to read across all the policies all the time, and it's almost the cumulative impact of those policies and the cumulative decision-making that needs to be taken into account. So obviously the council are encouraging to go beyond Part L, and in terms of some aspects of it, HPF doesn't have significant issues with orientation, layout, and those aspects of ensuring a development that is designed in a way that seeks to limit the amount of carbon that's released. I think our concern is when it comes to the technical standards that are potentially being required. And it's the confusion, I think, within the policy in saying, actually encouraging to go beyond Part L, further and reasonable. But then coming in and saying, well, actually, any carbon has to be offset at the end. And it feels like it's coming back from an encouragement to then, actually, you then need to offset everything that you don't deliver in terms of improvements in other aspects of that policy, which would in effect be a net zero in the way that it's read, or the way that I read it. It may not be that's what the intention was, that the intention was meant to be if you can't provide on-site renewable energy, again, MPPF suggests that setting targets and standards with regard to that is an appropriate thing for local plans to do. But that's not how it reads in terms of that policy. It's a catch-all for everything. I think that's where, and then sort of, we have it in policy, and I know the council are proposing to remove that in terms of saying, including setting specific energy emissions targets. Sort of potentially, is that going to be set outside the local plan? But I know the council are proposing to remove that, so that's welcomed. I think that's an appropriate amendment. So I think, sir, I'm probably not being helping too much, but it's that clarity in terms of what actually the council mean when it comes to that offsetting, what it relates to, and then we turn to CC3. There's elements in terms of the performance gap. Obviously, if you're asking for building regulations, and that's tested through building regulations and considered through building regulations, and doesn't need to be, again, tested in terms of what that, about the performance gap in that. So again, it's those aspects that I would be concerned of how the decision maker would react, and actually how an applicant would react to some of these requirements. I personally think, especially if we're looking at the draft MPPF that's out, recognising that it is still draft and we don't have it, that the government's direction of travel is moving away from setting requirements around internal performance of buildings, the technical performance of buildings. And I think and those are going to be national development management policies or national policies for decision making
with regard to that. So you're going to have an even more confused situation moving forward with regard to what the council's intentions are with regard to this and with regard to carbon offsetting. So I'm just confused as to how these policies will necessarily work together and how a decision maker would react to each of those.
And I think probably inherent in my bumbling through the introduction to CC1, we are in the same space of just working out exactly what it does and therefore whether or not there is compliance, if you like, with policy. Maybe it's useful to follow this thread to go to policy CC3, because that's really where you would go, I presume, to know what you're being asked to provide in terms of energy performance. I think I'm right in saying we're in the territory of CC3. So that has a number of criteria. We've talked about the performance, or it's been mentioned the performance gap between built and designed and monitoring. That's in the first one. First criteria. Second criteria, which I think the council are proposing to amend, which is development is strongly encouraged to improve on the relevant target emission rates set out in building regulations, part L. That's a strong encouragement, that's not a requirement. It was mentioned that there's a modification potentially there to remove target emission rate. Can you just talk us through what the council's current position is on that?
I think the, excuse me, I think the, that wasn't in relation to that policy that was being referred to.
So that criterion, so criterion 2 stands, so
yes.
Development, it would still strongly be encouraged. Okay. Then we have criterion 3, and I have to say my knowledge of how precisely all the different standards relate to one another is not on point. So we have part L, we have BRE's home quality 5-star or passive house will be positively supported. Again, that's an encouragement inherently to go beyond. That's not a requirement, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
And then there is an expectation on non-residential development that you'd be BREEAM excellent. That is a requirement.
Yes.
And is that consistent with policy in your view?
I think, sir, in short, the answer is yes. And on the basis that I think it's that of all the standards when it relates to non-residential development, this is one that often appears within plans and policies. And it has been, as set out in a response to this question on CC3 at 3.4.12, we have tested that in viability terms for a viability assessment with regards to that.
So we have that one, which I think, I mean, you set out your response, that's true. We can look at it. And then you've got the unviability clause. Okay, fair enough. Proposals for retrofitting in 6 will be supported. Okay. Proposals must be in accordance with the Dacorum Strategic Guide, supplementary planning guidance. I think you'll know, as we've said a few times, what we'd say about that, having regard rather than forcing compliance or elevating the status of an SPD. So there's a lot in here. Sorry, that was maybe lengthy, but there's a lot in here to say that things are encouraged but not required. So if, say, a developer comes in, if we take the scenario, a developer comes in, I'm purely achieving part L, that would be in compliance with policy CC3, would it?
If it was residential, yes.
Well, that seems consistent with policy. where do we go now? And then do we go on to CC4 in terms of, I'm really trying to get a fix on what is the carbon offsetting. So if we go to CC4, okay, 4 criteria. First, maximize renewable opportunities. Secondly, major developments submit an energy statement, including various things. Thirdly, offering support for passive energy generation. And fourth, supporting in principle energy projects. So again, those strike me as encouraging. Are there any requirements in there? Or sort of thresholds as a basis on which you could calculate carbon offsetting?
Not necessarily thresholds, but there are expectations that on-site renewable energy generation will be demonstrated and large-scale major would integrate a new energy network into the network. It's the development.
Absolutely, but if I'm being maybe slightly facetious, and I think we've said it previously about requiring sort of documents, presumably someone could say, well, I've put one solar panel and that is my on-site renewable energy generation under the terms of the policy. So what I'm not, sorry, I don't mean to be facetious, what I'm really looking at, because obviously the council has made a case that there is a necessity for carbon offsetting. What I'm trying to establish is where the requirements are that would enable someone to calculate what that offset is. So I'm not being facetious, I'm not being cruel, I'm just really trying to work it out. From what I can see, I'm afraid if we get to the point where there isn't an answer, well, that policy then simply goes because it's not justified. So I'm pressing you quite hard, but in order to get that response. Then you can have a think about it. I don't need to press you here and now, but our position, and I think I'm right in saying, our position would be, if there isn't clarity as to what that achieves, and if it isn't clearly articulated in policy, then it can't be justified.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wonder, and again, I might be wrong, but I wonder whether the carbon offsetting, is that a hangover from previous sort of net zero aspirations? So let me express those right. Is what we're trying to struggle is, you do the things in CC 1 to 4. So you maybe have some on-site renewable, you lay your development out to sort of benefit from solar gain, et cetera, so you'll do all the things that are set out. But then it's this, well, this is how much carbon is being produced. What then are you offsetting? What level are you offsetting to? What's that going to cost you? What are you trying to achieve? And that's where it all sort of falls down, I think. So I think on that basis, I don't think that CC5 is justified, unless you can, well, I don't think it's justified, I don't think it's effective either, probably more critically. So is there any views as to why that policy should remain and how it's going to be effective? Again, putting yourself in that developer's position, where do we go to really work out what we need to do and what we need to provide?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the feedback and discussion on that. So by way of context, you're obviously aware of the Council's climate emergency, and that was declared. And one of those initial steps coming out of that at a point in time was a big drive for a carbon offset fund. And you know, the Council has done a lot of work at the time on that. And I guess this is probably you know, a nature of various things that have happened since then, nationally and otherwise, and the various, you know, ministerial statements and other elements and how far we can go with plans. And I think we appreciate the feedback on that. And I think it's something we will absolutely go away and give serious consideration about the effectiveness of that policy as a whole and the clarity, you know, what it can do. I think there's an exercise for us again to probably look at the requirements, which we're being hopefully very clear on in this hearing session. We're not intending to exceed particular targets. We do want to encourage beyond that rather than require. But then I think there is a final exercise for, as you clearly spelled out, what do we do with regards to that final piece about anything and how we would secure anything maybe that is, you know, that final piece with regards to carbon offsetting. So it's a valid point. There was some detail in terms of the supporting text about how it will be calculated, etc. And there was good intentions at the time for the council to be looking to prepare further guidance on this. That hasn't been progressed as in a timely manner alongside this for us to be able to kind of draw more upon that and say a bit more about that. So we will take that feedback with regards to the soundness of that policy.
I have been involved with plans, most people probably know, where there have been, and we have found policies sound, and they're out there and they're adopted, then they have carbon offset policies. But I think where they differ is they set out a carbon reduction requirement. So there are plans out there that will set out a sort of, and a lot of these obviously are probably 4, 5, 6 years old now, but they were sort of an age where they set out a sort of net zero requirement or a level of carbon emissions. And then what those policies did was say, if you can't meet that, the surplus or the difference, that's then a quantum which informs your carbon offsetting. So everyone knows, okay, there's a measure there, and we haven't met it for whatever reason. There could be some site specifics. We haven't met that quantum, that difference, that gap in performance, then equates essentially to a commuted sum, basically. And I think that's the difference here, because you don't have that sort of stage one, sort of this is what we're seeking to achieve, and we know the reasons why, and why the plan is as it's set out. That then ultimately means you can't have that carbon offsetting policy because it's not effective. There's no mechanism to test the difference to say, right, you fell short by this much or this much, therefore a commuted sum is required.
Thank you. It's something I think we will just double check with the relevant teams within the council just to understand their most up-to-date position on this. Is there anything more in terms of clarity we could bring into this? But absolutely, we take your points and feedback on this. Take that quite clearly.
And I think as well, there's a lot in these policies, and we'll come on to some of the other policies where there's a lot in as well. And it's, you know, it's not necessarily criticism. We're not here to make the plan better. We're here to address soundness. But there's a lot in these policies, and I do take Ms. Barrett's point and others that it does become difficult. You know, you've got 1, 2, 3, 5 policies and sort of quite a few pages. And again, just have a little bit of a sort of, I think probably a sit down and a bit of a sense check. Is there anything in these policies that contradicts one another? And it's that internal conflict. And I think it does become difficult for users of the plan. And we've heard it from developers, we've heard it from local residents about what exactly do you want me to do? That's the critical question here. What do you want me to do? There's lots of encouragement and sort of persuasion and please do this, but right, okay, I'm a developer. What do I need to do? How do I meet these development requirements?
Absolutely, sir. We'll take that away.
Now, just before we come on to some other parts of CC1 and elsewhere, I was just looking, and I know Herts County Council, who aren't here, have commented on BREEAM excellent in the context of, well, CC1, CC3, CC1 criteria 3E. And they propose a modification I don't know if you've seen that and if you've taken that forward. Just get the council's view on their perspective there.
We stated our view in DBC ED 47, Statement of Common Ground with HCC in paragraph 3.56.
And does that arrive at a particular modification, an agreed position, or is it just agree to disagree?
We disagreed. Our view is that policy CC33 shouldn't provide for a range of standards, as this would reduce the impact of achieving accreditation and may lead to applicants focusing solely on the cost of a particular accreditation to the detriment of the sustainability outcome.
I had actually thought it was CC3 criterion 4 talks of a minimum BREEAM standard of excellent. And then if we go to CC1, criterion 3, no, I'm wrong, criterion 3E talks of BREEAM very good just for water efficiency. So I thought it was a concern about the relationship of those two, but I mean, I think nevertheless that needs a bit of, as Mr. Birkinshaw said, just going through to make sure there are no sort of internal conflicts. And I take the council's point that, and this is why we spent a little bit of time earlier exploring it, that these are standards that are encouraged to be worked towards. They're not a single standard that's encouraged to be worked towards, and they are not also a standard that is required. So I can see the council's perspective there, that you want to offer the encouragement to go higher, but not necessarily to hedge your bets to any particular standard, because as we all know, they become out of date quite quickly, and certain ones disappear and certain ones come. So I understand that. Okay. So just my last point, and I don't know if there are any other points on CC1, is probably just well, there's one observation, which is if you are going through the sort of process of looking at consistency with other policies, if there's any duplication, there is a lot in here about flood risk. And I understand that because it's obviously relevant to climate change, absolutely. But you also have a separate policy that we talked about earlier, was NE8, that is about flood risk. So just think if that needs to be duplicated. But the main comments I have seen on this, and I may be wrong in this, are on 3E, limiting residential indoor water consumption to 110 litres per person per day. Now, I've seen a few comments on this, but I wonder if I'm misleading myself, and those comments are actually mostly positive, given that, you know, the water stresses in Dacorum. I think it's actually the Chiltern Society, who were here earlier, weren't they? And they mention encourage HQM5 is no longer a standard. Well, I don't know what that means. Does that mean anything to you?
They stated that BRE HMQ5 star would not be, well, they use the word pointless, as there's no record of HQM 5-star on the BREEAM register, and it's not used by residential developers. And reflecting your points previously, our view is that sustainability assessments and standards have been an area of change nationally, reflecting the stepping points towards net zero. And, you know, we refer to some nationally recognised standards, but we don't require development to achieve these. But still, we think it's appropriate to include these high standards within the plan to reflect the plan's ambition and strategic objectives.
And where does HQM or HMQ 5-star come in? Where is that referenced? Is that CC3?
Yes, that's right. So what we've suggested as a modification to CC1 2E, rather than having setting carbon emission targets, which implies that the plan is requiring a percentage uplift of the dwelling's target emission rates, which it doesn't. We instead reflect CC3 by saying in CC1 2E, encouraging development to have high levels of thermal efficiency, including achieving recognised accreditation standards where applicable.
That makes sense. Okay, so I think unless there are any other comments on CC1, let's move on to CC2. I think the council is fairly clear about having a good thorough look at whether there's any repetition, whether there's anything that can be clarified, and indeed the carbon offsetting element, which was, I suppose, the mainstay of the discussion on the CC policies. Mr. Birkinshaw, anything on CC1? No? Anyone else? No? Okay. CC2, which is sustainable design and construction. And we did ask a specific question because there's a replication of the 2 trees criterion, which I know the council is taking away anyway under 3C.
Just on that, because I said we would come back to it. Let me just turn back to remind me, was it any 11? I think it was. One second. What's the page number for any 11? 86, thank you. Yeah, so this is why I said we can come back to this, because there's a cross-reference. I think if you want to go down the route of sort of specifying numbers of trees as replacements, then is it unsound? Potentially, there's an argument that it's not unsound. That's your threshold. That's what you're seeking to do. I think, having sort of looked at this, if you look at any 2, it's the criteria where it says where a tree or hedgerow is lost through development, a suitable replacement must be provided. You could almost just end there. You know, suitable alternatives could be provided. It's this same characteristics as the lost tree, same characteristics and length of hedgerow. It's whether that's appropriate, and I just worry that there'll be occasions where actually you'll be wanting a developer might come forward and they won't be the same characteristics as the lost tree. There might be better characteristics or different characteristics. And again, I think, if you want to go down the route of 2 or more net new trees, we'll leave that with you. You can take that away. Potentially, you could just finish with suitable replacement, essentially. I think that's probably the bigger point about it, and not trying to get dragged too much into sort of types of trees, lengths of hedgerows, and just probably taking a bit of a step back and giving yourself a bit more flexibility.
Yes, happy to look at that, and also taking into account policy NE 11.1C, where we talk about tree planting as well, which might also help with that.
Okay.
This is when I said obviously there's a lot of policies in this plan and there's a lot of very long policies, there's a lot of overly detailed policies, and I think this is an example of where you might catch yourselves out. You're right, NE 1C, D, include trees of or equivalent to nursery standard size or larger at the time of planting, depending on the scale and nature of development. And then you're talking about characteristics, same characteristics. Because there's so much in a lot of these policies, there is a risk that you end up in a difficult situation, almost tripping yourself up because there's too much. And that's why I've said a lot, less is more. You can have quite a sort of clear, succinct policy that gives both you and developers flexibility about what comes forward. So have a bit of a sort of sense check of a lot of these, and there's an awful lot of duplication and crossover as well. You know, just turning to CC policies, CC1 refers to 110 litres per person per day, and then it appears again in CC2. So again, there's sort of repetition and just being really careful. You probably just sort of, the hearings are difficult, we go through a lot and there's a lot to talk about, but I think probably what you need to do is just spend a bit of time and just go back and sort of just read these policies as a sort of developer or decision maker and just make sure that there's none of this sort of duplication that contradicts itself or internal conflicts within any of the policies.
It's fine, thank you.
Yeah, if nothing else than to save some poor DM officer having to refer to so many multiple policies in decision notices. But no, I think that's a fair, that's a fair point. And inevitably, an examination is probably not a fun process where a lot of things come under scrutiny, and it's just to give you that sort of robust challenge in terms of effectiveness. So I hope that feels fair. I mean, on CC2, and this again I think it's cropped up twice before, is the low embodied carbon materials. So this is policy CC2 criterion 3B, and it has cropped up in others, I think CC1, and previously you dealt with you were leading on a policy, weren't you, Mr. Birkinshaw, where this was there as well. I think my slight wariness with how CC2 is constructed, absolutely fine to encourage the use of low embodied carbon materials, that's fine, but the way I read it is you have to adhere to the mitigation principles in criterion 3, and one of those mitigation criterions is you have to select building materials which have low embodied carbon. And I mean, that strikes me as the subject of a sort of dissertation more than perhaps a local plan policy as to what that means. So I think we would be much more comfortable if the plan encouraged the use of lower embodied carbon materials, perhaps, than the requirement to select those which have low embodied carbon. I think it's that encouragement is fine, but the way it's phrased is potentially problematic from an effectiveness point of view.
Thank you, yeah. Absolutely fine to take those points away. I think, as I said, broader sense check, we need to just be very clear what's required in the plan, and we're quite clear, hopefully, that we know what's required, but also be very clear what's encouraged. That goes beyond what's required, and for the policies to make that more explicitly clear.
And also on that, we've suggested in our hearing statement that we reorder policy CC2 to just help with the way that it's understood. So we've suggested that we start with the major developments, submitting the sustainability statement, then going on to the mitigation principles and adaptation principles, and then moving on to other types of development. So there isn't a conflict about what development should do and what major development should do.
And I think, well, in what you've just said, Ms. Covington, that's very apt for policy CC3 as well, isn't it? Not necessarily reordering, but just being clear what's a requirement, what's an encouragement. And I think you've got that point loud and clear on CC3 from our earlier discussions. I didn't have any other questions on CC3, having gone through it in some detail, but Mr. Barron, did you want to? Yeah. Could you just turn your microphone on? It's important for the cameras. Thanks.
Just in terms of CC2 and in the mitigation principles, when we look at part E of that, again, it's create future-proof design and able to retrofit it for higher energy efficiency standards. I think the difficulty we have is if we have changing building regulations, what that actually means moving forward in terms of building regulations that requires already the use of heat pumps and air source heat pumps. And then, so you're moving to a stage where you're what does the decision maker, how does it address that in terms of a changing approach to building regulation? I think this is where the industry has a problem, and indeed government has it, in terms of trying to set out specific technical standards and address technical standards through, well, local plans, rather than actually ensuring that these are just delivered through building records, recognise that the fact that future home standards has been so long coming forward, I think that there's been a bit of a vacuum there that people have been trying to fill. But I think as we move forward, as a decision maker, you want to be able to say, well, actually, what's required? Here it's meet building regulations. And I think that's essentially what the council is saying with regard to CC2 and CC, actually across the suite. And then it's an encouragement to go beyond. And I think that's in essence, what needs to be set out within these policies. And I think that just elements that you pointed that, Sarah, in terms of the encouragement, in terms of low embodied carbon materials, I think those are elements that can be set out within a sustainability statement. But it is encouraged in terms of, well, rather than setting very specific and well, not hard targets, but setting very specific requirements within this in terms of those mitigation principles. So I think it just needs that reworking to think actually what is necessary if you're asking for building regulations, or if that's all you're asking for is what else is needed really.
So the concern there is with the term sort of future-proof. Does the future is uncertain, and you don't know what that future-proofing might entail, which I think is I think is a fair point, and it's one, to be honest, that I sort of glanced over and thought, well, okay, well, if you're creating an adaptable, an adaptably designed dwelling that could, make provision for future technology, I didn't necessarily see that as a problem, but it seems to be, it revolves around the sort of future-proofed element and not knowing what the future might hold. Is that?
I think it just goes back to the effectiveness point as well. Create a future-proof design to enable retrofitting of higher energy efficiency standards, such as heat pumps, etc. How does an applicant even demonstrate that? Future-proof design, a volume house builders, one of my parents sort of house builders might just turn around and say, well, all the dwellings are future-proof because we could retrofit solar panels to them. It doesn't really, I'm not sure it really gets you anywhere. There's other things in there as well, again, there's duplication of requirements, but explain how the buildings have been designed to have a long life. Again, I'm a developer, I'm not really sure what I need to do there other than say, of course my building will stand the test of time. How would you then say it won't? If a flat roof is required, use a green roof. If this is not possible, a lighter coloured material. Again, why?
If maybe we've switched roles to the ones you might typically associate. If I might suggest, it may be that in the process of you reflecting, and I've heard that we do need to have a break because of something to do with the live stream in about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. But it may be in the process of reflecting that actually these policies do condense. So we'd be fine to support, say, a smaller number of policies or a set of clear statements, and that you have the narrative, the corporate objectives, what's encouraged, what would be welcome in supporting text, and that's a very reasonable approach, provided that there is, a clear set of statements in terms of all the CCs as to how someone will react to development. So maybe that's one approach to think about, and it's not necessarily. And I think, as I said at the start, absolutely right that the council declares whatever emergencies and creates whatever strategies to deal with climate change. But in terms of how that gets articulated, that's really where I think there's a bit of a rub at the moment.
Thank you, sir. Absolutely. And dare I say, it's quite tricky for plans when climate agendas and climate emergencies are top on council's list right now, that the nature of having to deal with this matter is, as set out in some of these, does traverse many chapters of the plan. That cross kind of question. We also have the requirements, and we have to look at that and explore, how it can be kept up to date in light of any changes that might occur beyond those set out in policy as well. But as I said, we're quite happy to take that away and look at the potential inconsistencies or duplication, and then look at what is required and then what's encouraged, and see if there's anything more that could be done to rationalise that list.
Thank you. So that's very helpful, and absolutely recognise planning's not easy. So absolutely recognise that. Okay, if we move on to CC4 then, if we may. So that again, 4 criteria. Firstly, maximise opportunities. Energy statement. I think I've gone through these, haven't I? I suppose I wanted to ask where we come to criterion 3. Is this a policy aimed towards, say, housing standards? It is in part, but it also seems to be under criterion 3 a policy aimed at, say, let's say solar farms, as an example. So I suppose that's the first question. And the second question is, if it is aimed at standalone energy generation, renewable energy generation, is it justified in that criteria says, well, okay, we support low carbon energy generation, correct me if I'm wrong, where they can demonstrate there are no adverse impacts, including on the landscape. So yeah, can you just talk me through the council's position? I suppose firstly, that applies, this policy applies both to, say, a house builder, and it applies to people bringing forward standalone renewable energy generation, is that right?
Thanks, sir. So I think, again, we've probably done a little bit of chopping and changing and bouncing around. So there's some, we've already, I think, got some takeaways from a short while ago, but you're absolutely right. I think overarching kind of expectations set out in point 1 as a general kind of capture all, but I think the effectiveness of that. Then point 2 deals with major developments, again, with reference to energy statements. We've got some feedback on that, detailing how renewable low carbon energy technologies will be utilised. I think, notwithstanding that, it's how they demonstrate that at the application stage, whether it has to be a specific piece of document or whether it can be dealt with through other means, as you said, whether through a planning statement or through otherwise, depending on scales. And then point 3 deals with that renewable, that specific proposals that are more specific to the delivery of renewable and low carbon energy generation. There's a short number of criteria. Yes, I take the point that maybe those references to landscape is possibly something that is reflected elsewhere, but I do think you have to look at that in the context, and probably my experience too of working on renewable projects some years ago. You do have to have some additional kind of considerations there with regards to the impacts of certain schemes, whether it be wind farms, solar generation, etc. And I think probably these areas are possibly in a new phase of national policy where it relates to these in terms of onshore developments. But there's certain criteria there. It's not something we've had to deal with at length in the past. This is relatively new to an area predominantly covered by Greenbelt. It may come forward and we will have to consider it. So for that, we have put in some requirements should that happen. There are parts of our borough which are not covered by Greenbelt and may be feasible too. And then, again, and point 4 is proposed for community energy projects promoted by local communities or through that will be positively supported. And we recognise there are some of those potentially emerging in areas such as Kings Langley right now, relative to other data centres in the area, and we're looking at that in the realm.
And I think we have, I think I'm correct in saying, Mr. Burnshaw, no issue really with the criterion 1. There's maybe something about effectiveness in criterion 2 in terms of, well, what does that actually mean? What is kind of encouraged? Criterion 3, I think that's absolutely right. There are specific implications, flicker, glare, aerodromes, you name it, with say solar farms, wind turbines, whatever standalone energy generation we're talking about. But it's just to make sure that the criteria there are consistent with other criteria, any 11 various other landscape requirements, I suppose, rather than potentially suggesting that nothing can come forward anywhere, if I can put it like that. And no particular issue from my perspective with criterion 4, because of course, if you have got something that is promoted through a neighbourhood plan, it will be part of the development plan in any event. Okay, thank you. So if there's nothing on CC4, I don't have anything on CC5 because we've talked about that in the round. I think there's some reflection going to go on in terms of, well, what exactly is that aiming towards? Is it even necessary in that context? So I think unless anyone wants to talk any more about carbon offsetting under CC5, let's move on. We didn't put CC6 on the programme, but we did touch upon it earlier, and I think it's worth just having a look at it now. So this is protection from environmental pollution, presumably agent of change, contaminated land, water quality, etc. I haven't seen any particular representations on this. I think a point Mr. Birkinshaw would make, if I didn't, is just the length and the potential for duplication. So if we take an example, light pollution, for example, under criterion 8, is very detailed in terms of, well, I absolutely love lux levels, and in terms of 10 meters at the top of the bank, I really like the detail when it comes to a planning application. But in terms of the requirements in a local plan, again, the level of precision potentially may lead you astray. If, for example, I don't know, there is a particularly sensitive watercourse, the population of bats that needs less than 2 lux, for example, or needs a greater separation, or perhaps justifies a lesser separation. So I think, and I don't want to go through it in rigorous detail, Mr. Birkinshaw may, but I think the overarching point there would just be to give that a very critical, very careful look, to make sure that there's no duplication or inadvertent, hostage to fortune thresholds there. Anything to add, Mr. Birkinshaw, on CC6?
Yeah, there's an awful lot in CC6. I would just reiterate that there's an awful lot, and it's going back to whether or not it is relevant and justified. Obviously, the point that Mr. Bristow made about proposals for new exterior lighting schemes will be expected to, and then there's an awful lot in there. What's that sort of referring to? Where is this going to be required? There's other things in there, isn't it? Development of land for noisy countryside sports. What's that? What does that mean? It's got to be located outside of the Chilterns National Landscape and the most sensitive parts of landscape regions. It completely understand the purpose and the rationale, and it's all very well sort of based. I just worry that you have too much detail, that it becomes almost a sort of impossible task already for your DM colleagues to really sort of go through and demonstrate that all of these requirements are met. Or probably what will happen is trying to then substantiate and justify where they depart from some of these. So again, really, really sort of important aspects, but again, have a bit of a sense check. Is it all relevant? Can it be sort of broken down into what the really critical things are? I think it probably strays a little bit into too much detail, and I think that goes for a lot of what we've talked about this afternoon. Again, not diminishing the importance of these things, but just worried that in terms of your own practical use of your plan, whether there's just too much detail in a lot of this.
Thank you, sirs. We'll take that away. It's it's a pollution policy, and it's long, and it is very detailed, and I think I understand that. It's been heavily influenced and informed by those who deal with applications on a day-by-day, the environmental health team in regards to air quality and contaminated land and soil pollution in particular. Water quality, I think we've had regard to the key stakeholders and bodies in shaping that particular element, and they were comfortable with that. When it comes to light pollution, we have, it's one of those areas as well, just broadly speaking, actually previous plans and appendices to save policies and previous plans is actually far more detailed than what was in this when it came to older versions. We've actually sought to even, dare I say, reduce it through this plan. It's again, this one is really driven by the case officer, really driven by development management and those who deal with the particular details of schemes here, and having regard to that wealth of experience over years, we felt that, and we do appreciate it's a long policy. We have considered breaking it down even into sub-policies just to make it flow. It is a head scratcher. So we will reflect on it. I think broadly speaking, there's maybe tweaks to be made here and there. I'm a little bit unsure right now as to the detail, but that final sense check point, absolutely, we will take it back to our colleagues and just say, are you absolutely sure this is necessary before we seek to finalise it?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really fair point. And if we were to sort of to speak openly as if it were to be received by your colleagues, obviously there's a wealth of experience, as you say, that has informed what we have here. And what we are saying is not that that's unimportant, nor indeed that all these things could not be agreed subsequently in terms of a planning application. So it's not in any sense, I think Mr. Birkinshaw has mentioned, to say that they're not important. For the function of a local plan, to ensure that you don't inadvertently tie yourselves in knots, that's the real point. And therefore cause more work and aggravation for you and your colleagues down the line. So it's just about the different functions. So don't in any way think that we're challenging anyone's contributions or expertise, which we can tell. It's a huge amount of work gone into it. We can tell why it's there. We're just trying to sort of advise to how the plan can be got into a usable shape for everyone. So, okay.
It's things like this. It's things like this reference. I just picked one up. 6 part B, sort of demonstrating that building regulations will be met. Again, probably goes a bit too far.
Okay. From my perspective, there's a logical break between the CC policies and the others first. There's also a need to break, and I'm looking in various places because of something to do with the live stream.
Yeah, as I understand it, classic council IT is that the laptop that's running this has got a forced restart, which is currently ticking down throughout the day, and we're getting close to that 0 point. So it's only just to give a little safeguard, just to allow that to happen and just make sure that we're not all going to fall off a cliff edge.
No, indeed, I could probably use forced reset myself in various ways. But so what I think we will do is, unless there are any comments on CC 1 to 6 that you haven't been able to make, anyone, if we pause now for 10 minutes or so, deal with anything that needs to be dealt with the live stream. Maybe let's should we have 15 or come back at.
Can we do we need to break right now?
I think it's just to allow the laptop to restart, so it can happen now.
Okay, so then, well, let's have 15 minutes then, because laptops say they need 4 minutes but need 28 or something. Let's come back at 25 past then, and we will then go through the remaining policies. So that's D1 and the H's. Now, we have sort of, I have to say, we've given you a bit of a grilling on the CCs. There's far less from our perspective in those. So, got some of the bad news out of the way. Now we're moving on to the good news. So you can look forward to that. Okay, so we'll pause now, come back at, what did I say, 25 past? Yeah. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Okay, hard reset complete. So let's resume. And D1, H9, etc. As I think I trailed, I think this will be a lot quicker. I see there are some other colleagues around the table. That's good. And obviously you got a good billing earlier. So welcome to the table. I think possibly the way of doing this, given where we are in proceedings and given that you've heard various general messages, is to skip over those general messages because you've heard them about reflecting, say, SPDs and the like. You've heard those, so I don't need to touch on those. Maybe if I just go through, because there have been relatively few representations on this, and of course, you know, there's no one particularly around the table. If I just go through and pick out maybe the things that have cropped up to me in terms of consistency, or to us, sorry, I should say, in terms of consistency with national policy, in terms of consistency with statutory duties, which comes into it, in terms of heritage, and then if there's anything that we need to talk about or explain, we do that. Does that sound fair? But I mean, as I said, taking strategic policy D1, delivering high quality design as an example, I mean, it's detailed, but I think almost all of it is consistent with the design objectives in terms of the NPPF, in terms of the National Design Guide, in terms of the PPG. The only two of the design principles, I think, that came to mind when I was looking through this. A distinctive place talks about reinforcing local character. And that's understandable unless that local character is not worth reinforcing. So I did wonder if there was something there about instead of designed to reinforce or improve upon local character or to improve upon the design of the area might be advantageous where, say, you're dealing with something that isn't in a distinctive location, but which may be improved in terms of design.
Thank you, sirs. If it's helpful, the policy is strategic and it has been heavily influenced and informed by our strategic design guide, which is included in the library's DESO 1.1. And each of those principal themes, a distinctive place, etc., is reflected within the Part 2 design principles of that SPD. So what we are seeking to do here is what I would probably say is a good rule of thumb, is where you do have that really overarching design guidance to try and ensure that there is a really good synergy between what the policy is saying in terms of those principles and where the more detailed guidance flows from that. And that's the rationale mainly about the wording in that. I think the outcome side is you know, it seeks to summate some of that where it can. There may be opportunities to maybe do more on that. But the principle of how the policy then is consistent with the SPD and the further guidance. That was the intention of this in terms of those principles.
No, I totally understand. I think that's explained, isn't it, in terms of the structured design process and earlier on in the sort of justification for strategic policy D1. I totally get that. I think I will leave that with you. It's probably at the fringes of soundness, but just in terms of distinctiveness, on occasion there are areas which are not distinctive, and there may be cause for innovation or improving design standards. It's a very minor point, I think. What is potentially a little bit more of a point is when we come to great homes, the outcome is promote high quality homes and avoid significant detrimental impacts on the amenity of occupiers of neighbouring properties. Now, the reason I'm flagging that up is because there's criterion 3, which is all development must avoid visual intrusion, loss of sunlight and daylight, loss of privacy, which is a much higher test than avoid significant detrimental impacts. That seems to suggest there should be no adverse effect under criterion 3. I'm all in the realms of effectiveness here. And we have the MPPF that talks, the 2023 version that talks about a high standard of amenity. So to avoid any, well, are we going for, significant detrimental effects bad? Are any effects bad? Well, actually, probably what you're talking about in line with the MPPF is ensure a high standard of amenity. Probably avoids any sort of compare and contrast between holding up different standards. But I think that one seems to have landed. Understand it's about consistency between different parts of the policy and the framework. So other than that, I didn't have any particular points on strategic policy D1, unless Mr. Birkinshaw did. No? Okay, and as I say, I haven't seen many representations on these, which suggest that they are pretty much on point. So if we then go, what was the next one up? We had H9, which I'll just go there, which is residential conversions and change of use to residential. Now, again, this is, in my view, under the maxim of less is more. Oh dear, is there another hard reset required? No, okay. It sets out very clearly conversions, high standard, taking full account of the character of the area, compliance with the following. That all makes sense. That's a nice pithy policy. I think that's good. The only thing I would say on this is when it comes to car parking. So we've got one criterion, 1B3, which then moves into not necessarily the adequacy of parking, but landscaping and matters of character and appearance. And that struck me as a little bit odd, given that anyway you've got an overarching policy in terms of character and appearance. It seemed to be actually proposals must demonstrate adequate parking that's sufficiently well designed, rather than taking that in a sort of landscaped sense. And I'm only saying that because when it comes to determining an application, you'll sort of look to this policy to talk about the principle of residential conversion, and if you like, the macro impacts. And you wouldn't necessarily think, there's a point about landscaping of parking in here. So,
thank you. Important feedback. I think yes, we'll take that away. I think this one might be a legacy from previous plans and how we've reviewed some of the existing policies coming forward. A secondary point is obviously when we're mindful of residential conversions and change of use, and I think everything around that and what that can do in terms of parking provision. And I think in practical terms that we've seen on the ground evidence where some of these frontages suddenly become very hard kind of frontages as a result of the need to convert or subdivide or do some of these elements. And it is just that point of detail. It's not a strategic design point. It is something really picked up at that level. Again, it's probably a point that we will just take back and just check with DM colleagues about the appropriateness of that point, if that's okay, whether they feel it's necessary.
You could probably do, you could probably achieve both objectives in the same criterion. So you say, suitable or appropriate levels of car parking should be provided, which remain well landscaped, say in existing trees, etc., etc. So you sort of, you've got the best of both worlds potentially, where you are ensuring that appropriate levels of parking are provided, but yes, seeking to avoid those situations you talk about where it just becomes a sort of, just hard standing right across the front of properties, etc. So it might be that you can address both in one go.
Okay, so you've got that, and also there is in clause 1B for not cause harm to residential amenity or the amenity of the surrounding area, which I think goes back to just being consistent in terms of, if you're talking about living conditions, you're talking about high standard, you're talking, significant unacceptable. It's just that sort of consistency of tests, really. have a reflect on there. Okay. So skipping through to H10, which is residential annexes. There's not a lot I'd say on this one. I think it's again, pithy and clear. The only point, if I was being hyper focused, is under 1B. Okay, so there's a lot of case law, and I suppose Mr. Howell Williams would draw my attention to that if I didn't mention. There's a lot of case law about residential annexes. I did wonder if, for example, the occupant will be a dependent relative went a little bit too far in terms of that functional connection. I think functional connection is fine to say, but giving a particular example may suggest that other examples of a way in which it's occupied is not functionally connected. That may go a little bit too far in terms of case law.
Thank you. The functionally connected point, it's a little bit, as an expansion on that, goes back to the habitats regs assessment and perhaps what's considered a new dwelling relative to an annex to an existing. And there's a big difference when it comes to the mitigation in that. And I think there is just that point there. But we take your point, we understand the feedback. I think the EG point there probably isn't necessary. Whether that could be something that, if we wanted to deal with through support and text.
I think it can simply be omitted because you've got a clear functional connection or words to that effect, which is the test, the threshold generally between whether something's ancillary or whether it's a new dwelling. So just inadvertently, if someone says it's not going to be occupied by a dependent relative, well, does that then knock it out even though it's functionally connected? So I would say, just in terms of not embroiling yourself in that, if there's a clear functional connection, job done really. Okay. Any other points, Mr. Birkinshaw? Okay, so let's move on to HE5. Is that right? That's the next one on the list, which is advertisements. Now, I understand why everything's in here, but I'm not sure criterion 1B is correct legally. When you talk about express consent, ensuring the advert doesn't harm any heritage asset is, I think I understand why that's there, but that's an extremely high test and not consistent with legislation, which, if you're in the territory of 66.1 or 72.1 of the Listed Building Act, talks about, it talks about having special regard rather than avoiding any harm, does not harm. So I think that one does need to change for consistency with policy and legislation.
Just thinking out loud here, you could maybe merge A and B. Is appropriate size, appearance, design, and position of the building or site which is displayed and does not detract from the visual amenity and character of the surrounding area. Because it's about highway safety and visual amenity, isn't it?
And you have separate policies on heritage in any event.
Yeah, in any event, you have your separate heritage policies. So that would probably neatly address it, whilst not sort of straying too far from the sort of the advert regulations.
Thank you. It's a point we probably again just want to reflect on ourselves. The tone of this policy sits within the historic environment area, and I think in terms of it's more, I think, tonally from feedback to date and from colleagues, it's about the advertisements probably within conservation areas, within those kind of older, more established parts, rather than maybe something that is the more modern kind of approach, and it's putting the checks on them. But in light of that, I would just need to take that away and just understand exactly whether totally we're changing the focus of what this policy intended to achieve, given it's about heritage.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you're pulling together multiple strings, and other people have informed this, and then you're sort of you're hearing what we're saying. You need to take that back. From our perspective, just that it's that threshold of setting no harm here, but in other historic policies saying, well, you follow the approach in statute, follow the approach in MPPF, and you do that balanced approach. Whereas when it comes to adverts, here we see no harm. And that, I understand why that's there, but there is an inconsistency. So absolutely. I was also slightly, I was intrigued, and this has probably come through kind of bitter experience, if I can call it that, in terms of adverts within the Chilterns National Landscape and its immediate setting. I mean, this is criterion 2. And again, it falls into the realm that we've talked about a few times of some really very specific requirements. Painted individually or lettered in a suitable manner. Oh, okay, I mean, but there may be adverts around that are existing, authorised, and not of that form, and yeah, and also in terms of elimination, I think it's fine to take a sort of purposive approach to one of the 2 limbs in which you can consider adverts, which is amenity, but to go to that level of detail, I think you'd be you'd occasionally come a cropper when it comes to development management processes. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, something we will just, I think, reflect on, I think, and just make sure that.
And if I'm in the mode of Mr. Birkinshaw, who's much better at this than me, it may just be, saying particular attention will be paid to the form, design, and method of illumination of adverts in sensitive areas, including conservation areas of Chilterns National Landscape and its setting. Mm-hmm. So it's setting out that there's a particular focus rightly there in terms of sensitive areas. It's not going to that next level of specifying the design, which I can understand why you do, but I think, that's probably our direction there.
Take that point, and we will look at that policy in general just to see if there's any opportunities for that, whether it's necessary.
Thank you. Mr. Birkinshaw, anything? No. Okay. Oddly, we have NE13 in the mix here, which is aerodrome safeguarding. As someone who's not the greatest fan of flying, this is obviously of utmost importance to me. But I didn't have any comments actually on the policy. It all seems very clear, very logical. I just wanted to know how that's articulated on the policy. Is it shown on the policies map, the extent of aerodrome safeguarding? Obviously, the policies map is not a development plan document, but if we have a certain area to which that policy applies, it needs to be consistent with it. That's something for you to take away, I think, and check.
Something we take away. I believe our interactive map, I think we've added it to it in light of this question. We have this dynamic where we're looking at what specific changes can happen through the plan and the modifications and allocations. There's also our approach is to try and maintain a kind of a live, almost living proposals map, which has listed buildings, everything else kept up to date in line with the inventory from historic England. This one could change, the safeguarding areas could change as a result, not outside of the plan making process. And there's a weird dynamic because I think there is a requirement that it should be reflected on proposals maps, but ultimately where it changes, we hit a little bit of a hazy area about how we update proposals maps. So we do fall into that category where we'd like to kind of maintain them alongside the adopted policies map as a sort of living living kind of designations map that you can basically switch on and switch off and see it as you wish, and keep it under review.
Yeah, well, I mean, legislation in terms of policies map hasn't kept pace with everything going digital, being updated. So I think that's a really valid point, I think it's the Civil Aviation Authority that maintains those maps. So for our purposes, the policy is there, it's consistent with what the MPPF says. So long as that's articulated correctly, at this point in time via the policies map, then any future updates, well, they'll flow from the CAA, not from us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So nothing more on any 13 from me, which moves us on to the issue 2, which is the bundle of historic environment policies.
So can I just,
of course,
ask, was there no comment on policy D3?
Excellent and very nicely phrased.
No, I don't take the credit. Somebody behind me does.
You could have said, you fool, you've missed D3, and I wouldn't have taken offence. Let me see. No, I did want to say criterion to having read and reread D3. Criterion 3A to E and 4 seem absolutely on point in terms of, doing what other policies have occasionally sort of slightly missed the mark in terms of talking about the sort of specifics of what is in, what is wanted there. I think those are very good. My only point on D3, it was just so I could clarify my understanding really. It seems to govern both the process of public art in itself, so when there is a public art scheme, and what is necessary in association with development. It seems to cover both those angles. And I was seeing some nods, so it does cover both what is required of development and if there are specific proposals. I just wondered why it's only required in certain areas and in relation to large-scale development, as I think that's criterion 2.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a more of a proportional approach within Dacorum. We've got a public art strategy which is emerging. I think we recognise that not every development is probably expected to contribute towards public art. So we do kind of look in the context of those that may be likely to have local centres or focal points. But also within Hemel Hempstead, if you have been walking through the town centre, there's a rich kind of heritage of public art from the new town. And that kind of trickles through. The same with regards to Two Waters and talking about maybe some of our allocations and focal points and how we could seek to embrace that. So it's really considered in terms of, we don't want to be we recognise that public art is not necessarily front and centre when it comes to contributions and what's necessary, but I think when it comes to those bigger sites, and particularly especially in those important locations within the plan, we do kind of put more of an emphasis and regard on those developments to look at this a little bit more.
Understood. I think that makes a lot of sense why there's a particular focus then on the town centre, the Two Waters Maylands. That makes complete sense. My only question therefore remains, what is for this context of policy D3 large-scale development elsewhere? And I couldn't sort of find a threshold, but is it, is it getting towards development which establishes a new community or sense of place will need to incorporate public art rather than large-scale development, as you may get into arguments about what that is? I'm just speaking my mind in terms of what is large-scale development. If that could be turned to a more, sort of I keep on saying the word purposive, the sort of the intent of it is to provide public art where that is a focus for significant new development or a significant new community or redevelopment proposal. That may be a clearer way of phrasing it. I'm not sure it's a matter of soundness, but it was just trying to work out exactly where developers would be expected under the policy to contribute towards public art. And that could do, I think, with a bit of thought. As I say, I'm not sure it's a matter of soundness. Does that make sense?
Thank you, sir. There is a footnote in regards to that large-scale development. It does cross-reference. It's within our constitution. There is a definition of large-scale major development, which residential units to be constructed as 200 or more. Now the question is maybe the constitution may change. This is a point of which changes first. So we have drawn upon that as our example, and that I think shapes and informs some of our committees, etc. But it may be more appropriate that we maybe just lift that definition and maybe look to include that within the glossary and maybe cross-reference the Constitution as the most up-to-date position.
Or just say it, I think. If that's what your definition is, I'd say it rather than relying on, obviously, like you say, links to things that might change. If that changes, then does the plan become out of date, etc. It's about clarity and effectiveness. Just again, bit of a sense check. How can we just tidy up this policy to make it abundantly clear what we need to do, where and how, really?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, excellent, and thank you for bringing me back onto D3. That was very useful. So, unless I'm getting it wrong again, we are on HE1, HE2, HE3, HE4, and that would be all that we've got left in the agenda for today. Okay, so obviously with the council's hearing statements on this, excellent answer, I have to say, in terms of question 1 about how the plan has been supported by appropriate and proportionate evidence in terms of, well, there's an explanation of how the HELA process knocked out sites at a strategic level where there's a significant proportion of kind of sensitive assets. And I know there are a series of modifications agreed with Historic England. So if we move to HE1, sorry, I'm just going to turn my microphone off. Okay. So I think this is obviously for the most part, is very well phrased. It's consistent with the MPPF. It's consistent with statute. All development will favour the conservation of heritage assets. Okay, that's a broad term, but you know that fits in terms of those consistency. If I can just though look at criterion 3, all developments involving heritage assets should avoid causing harm to the significance, including the setting. Where harm to or loss of heritage cannot be avoided, measures to minimise or mitigate the harm caused will be considered and balanced against the heritage and public benefits. I think maybe something has just gone awry in that last bit. Measures to minimise or mitigate the harm will be considered and balanced against the heritage and public benefits. It's not the measures to mitigate, it's the harm that's balanced against the public benefits. So the measures to mitigate the harm, seek to reduce it, and then you balance it against the public benefits. You don't look at the mitigation measures and the public benefits in that sense. So I think that's possibly just a sort of typo that's crept in there. But absolutely right to look at measures to minimise or mitigate. Absolutely right to look at public benefits and to reach a balance between the two. In terms of what is the harm that would result, but I think that just needs a bit of clarity there. Other than that, I didn't have any comments other than I've not seen a comparable criterion 6 before, which is that local charitable organisation or groups with an appropriate interest should be invited and facilitate to remove, take off site and conserve structures and features of heritage assets that will be lost in the course of demolition to avoid the loss of valuable assets significant to Dacorum's heritage. I know what you mean, absolutely. If you've got a local history organisation that might take something that's going to be demolished from a building, what I might say though is that would be covered, that would in all likelihood be covered anyway in some form of recording condition or publication condition that you would apply in the development management process. I struggle with it slightly, just in terms of, again, the level of specificity in a local plan. In that respect, I understand the reason for it, but I think perhaps it just goes a step too far, and those safeguards could be there anyway in terms of involving local historical organisations.
Thank you, sir. We'll take that away. It perhaps might be something that's more suited to the supporting text informing the policy as a little nod and recognition that I think developers should be maybe proactively, where this is the case, looking at this, or our applicants should be looking at this. But as you say, it's probably a point of detail that maybe isn't perhaps necessary in the policy.
I think that's right. Absolutely encourage engagement with local historic societies in the supporting text. Insofar as the policy is concerned, well, that aim is slightly different. It's to reduce any harm and balance those benefits which may, in the fullness of a development management processing, involve some sort of recording condition engagement with the local body. That's fine, but I think to feature it in a policy is, again, it's one of those things that may trip it up. Okay, any other points on HE1? No? HE2, again, clear policy, except for criteria 1 and 2 seem to be mutually exclusive. Criterion 1 says, 1A says the proposal will have no adverse effect, or no adverse impact. And then criteria 2 looks at the judgment you reach where there is an adverse impact. So that needs a bit of a tweak. And my suggestion there would just simply be focusing on criterion 2, because that is entirely consistent with, is it paragraph 212, 213, one of those paragraphs with the MPPF, in terms of clear and convincing justification. I fear the proposal having no adverse impact in 1A is too strict a test. Okay.
So it just, if it's okay, I'll just introduce my colleague, Chase Ashby.
Yeah, Mr. Ashby.
Yes, sir. So ultimately, we are proposing a minor modification to HE2 criterion 1A. So instead of referring to, or as it is at the moment, saying the proposal would have no adverse impact, we are proposing that instead states that the proposal would minimise any adverse impact instead, and just to ensure that it's fully consistent with national policy.
That sounds right. You were there before me. Excellent. Okay, that makes sense. And you may be ahead of me here as well. In terms of designated buildings or structures, you've got clear and convincing justification. However, in conservation areas 3B, you've just got clearly outweigh the harm. Clear and convincing justification is the phrase you've correctly identified, is there in the framework. Public benefits, always when you're looking at harm to a designated heritage asset, it's clear and convincing justification. Just a small terminological point.
I think you're possibly about to pick up. We've looked at this and there's a few revisions, just more wider revisions with this policy A. That first heading we were looking to delete. We don't think it's necessary. And then I think you just alluded to the potential that there'll be no substantial harm to the conservation. We propose to revise that to be less than substantial harm.
Excellent. I mean, it's very rare that you do get something that substantially harms a conservation area. I can't imagine what that might be, other than some form of apocalypse. But yes, I think yes, you're going to amend that to remove that because there is a just a sort of balancing exercise in the framework between harms and public benefits when we're talking about designated heritage assets. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay. If we just come on to criterion 4E, still on policy HE2, have regard to, well, absolutely, I think that's fine. Any conservation area, character appraisals prepared by the council. The bit I'm not entirely sold on is safeguard all aspects which contribute to the area's special interest and significance. Now, this may be something, again, that you've sort of reflected on in the fullness of time and think, maybe not. But again, that seems to set a higher test, so that's effectively amounting to no harm again. If you're safeguarding all aspects which contribute to special interest and significance, you're not opening the door to any potential harm that may need to be balanced against some benefits. So I think you've probably got the point on that. I see the logic in criterion 5. Again, I'm still on HE2. If you're going to demolish something, make sure you know what's going to replace it, and it's going to be good or better. Absolutely. That said, there are some instances where demolishing something is actually a preferential heritage outcome. Say, for example, there is, well, I don't know, an eyesore, and actually it is better if it is demolished. Point of fact. Just giving the council the ability to take that judgment. Again, criterion 5 may trip you up in the future. If someone says, well, we're going to demolish this building that's clearly derelict, it's detracting from character and appearance, and you go, we can't allow that because we don't know what's going to come in its place. So, okay. Okay, any other points on HE2? Okay, HE3? So, I'm sure, you know, inspectors are odd creatures sometimes, aren't they? I'm sure if you'd simply said what was in terms of the MPPF on non-designated heritage assets, we would say, well, what's the point in saying what's said in the MPPF on non-designated heritage assets? And I appreciate that what the policy HE3 has tried to do is to sort of create a local flavour to non-designated heritage assets. I think what's happened is in trying to do that, there are some tests that aren't there in the framework. So if we look at 1B, for example, the public benefits from demolition and redevelopment, whereas I think it's MPPF 1 paragraph 199 simply talks about there will be a balance. There's also a sort of a non-viability clause in there. There's reference to heritage and amenities. And I just think what the policy does is introduces a number of additional potential sort of checks and checklists. And I would, this is probably one instance where I would say, if you stick, if you want to, I mean, if there's a justification for a particular flavour, we can talk about that. But sticking very precisely to paragraph, I think it's 199. Of the framework in terms of non-designated heritage assets is probably safer in terms of consistency with national policy. Mr. Ashby.
Yes, so we have actually proposed another minor modification to HE 3.1b, which is stated in Table 1 of the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England, DBC ED 44. And that is to make reference to the need for a balanced judgment, or for criterion 1b to say that a balanced judgment concludes that the public benefits from demolition and redevelopment outweigh the resulting loss. So essentially just to, I guess, pick up that point that you made and make sure that the policy aligns with what's set out in the framework.
Excellent. Well, again, you're ahead of me, and I have read through everything, but that did slip my mind. So absolutely, if you can closely align it with what the NPPF says, then we can obviously endorse that from the perspective of consistency with national policy as a test of soundness. Okay. Anything else on HE3? No. Then HE4, archaeology. Before I put my foot in it again, and is there any agreement, Mr. Ashby or Mr. Layden, with Historic England on this, or no? Okay. I think the policy is good. The only thing I would say is criterion. Well, there are a couple of things. Just, and this is very detailed in terms of effectiveness, new developments must protect heritage assets of archaeological interest. I think archaeological interest itself is sufficient. Of course, archaeological interest does have an element of heritage significant, but there are potentially some issues with combining heritage assets and archaeological interest as they're dealt with separately in the NPPF. So new developments must protect archaeological interest, in my view, deals with that point of fact, because you're talking about archaeological interest. There may be some arguments, well, is something of archaeological interest a heritage asset, which has been argued, and I've dealt with arguments of that, is it demonstrably equivalent to a heritage asset? Rather a complex debate. But in terms of the purpose, new developments must protect assets of must protect archaeological interest, seems absolutely fine. Fine with criterion 2, consult. Fine with criterion 3, get an archaeological assessment. And fine with 4, subject to the council, just if I might suggest, it's probably Mr. Ashby, isn't it, just reflecting on whether that also needs to refer to recording. So you're talking there about, okay, when there is archaeological interest, preserve it. There may also be a case for recording, or so preservation in situ, or recording what was there as an alternative if it is going to need to be removed. So it would just be, I don't think that's a point of soundness, although the NPPF does talk about recording. Just have a think about whether that might help in terms of the options available to the council when archaeological interest is encountered. As I said, quicker than the CC ones, marginally. Any other points anyone has on any of the policies we've just been through?
I don't believe so, not from our end, sir. It's been helpful discussion, plenty for us to go in and dwell upon, but we will seek to take those on board.
Thank you, and thank you very much. You know, I do mean it. For the council has been very receptive and said they'll take away and think about things, and that's excellent. That means that we can work towards very much policies that are aligned with national policy and are consistent. So thank you very much for your diligence. And I've seen a lot of tapping and writing of notes. So thank you for that. Okay, Mr. Birkinshaw, anything from you before we adjourn for
no, just a couple of housekeeping matters then. So not sitting next week, so we're back week commencing the 23rd. So Tuesday the 24th, I sort of floated a suggestion that we tagged on the afternoon session to the morning. Is that doable, do you think? I don't think there's anybody down for the allocations at Grange Farm or London Road.
I think we should be okay with that. It's probably subject to, you know, the level of detail and feedback you might have to give on that. But I think it's doable.
It's one of those where Mr. Brisbane and I talked about it. We probably could, depending on how long. It's one of those. It's difficult to tell how long the Berkhamsted allocations will take because we're starting at 10. But if we finish at 12:30, I wouldn't want to come back to ask you one question on those two allocations, basically. If we could do, and if we could tag them on, and maybe excuse me, maybe just needs a note on the website to say that those will follow the Berkhamsted allocations. Just if someone's tuning in at 2 o'clock and they think, well, where's the discussion? They can see it was tagged on to the back of that. That would be great. Then we've got obviously some of the housing policies on the Wednesday. On the Wednesday afternoon, we've got housing land supply. What would be useful? Useful, not essential. If you did have time to update any of your housing land supply figures, just in relation to anything that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. So just being obviously a couple of spots. One site wasn't that was deleted.
Yeah, item 12.
And any way you think, obviously, I gave the chap a hard time, I can't remember his name, about deliverability on one site. But where we've talked about some sort of, big ticket infrastructure items that may affect deliverability. Have a little bit of if you've got time, I appreciate that you're in the examination hearings, so they are resource intensive things. If you haven't got time and it's too difficult and it's too complicated, don't. If you did have time to do a sort of very quick updating of your 5-year housing land supply position, that would be useful. Said useful, not essential, because when we go through housing land supply on the afternoon, there'll probably be a follow-up task for you to do, which will be to update your numbers. And then we've got 10 o'clock on Thursday, 26th, which is the reserve session where we're looking at the very sort of tightly focused issue around the golf course and the Sport England reps. That makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. That all seems sensible. Just to clarify, in appended to our matter 5 statements, we did have an updated trajectory. It doesn't reflect some of the discussion. It does reflect the deletion, I think, of that particular allocation. But we will review that request in light of that discussion.
In light of what we talked about, have a look at it, and if you think there's anything that's that's significant and material and can be easily updated, then we can do that and circulate it through Louise to participants as a sort of addendum to your hearing statements.
That's fine. Thank you.
Anything else? No.
Thank you. I think it's been very good. It's been a busy couple of days, but it's been
good. Like I say, we said on the session.
Thank you.
That's long sessions, but we do appreciate it, and we do appreciate sticking to the programme and getting through it. Like I said, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of policies. There's a lot of representations, but we do sort of appreciate the time that you put into that to ensure that we can stick to the programme. Really. Anything arising? Any questions from yourselves? No. Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll adjourn for the day and we will be back on the 24th, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.